Dust settled on the marble floor of the Senate. 9 centuries of unbroken silence died with a single gunshot. Governor Cassius lowered his weapon, stepping over the human ambassador's body. He thought he was executing a pirate. He didn't realize he had just unchained a sleeping apocalypse. The negotiation room smelled of polished brass and recycled oxygen. It was a smell Commander Abigail Cross had grown deeply tired of over her 30-year career. She sat across the wide, curved table from Governor Cassius. The imperial adjudicator was a tall, severe man who wore his authority like a heavy cloak. He was currently picking at his fingernails with a silver stylus. He wasn't listening. He hadn't been listening for the past 2 hours. The helium-3 refineries in Sector 42 are protected under Section 4 of the Orion Accords, Abigail said. Her voice was level, measured, and carefully stripped of any irritation. She tapped the datapad resting on the table. Earth built those refineries. Earth maintains them. Imperial taxation ships cannot seize our transport freighters in neutral space. Cassius stopped picking at his nails. He looked up, his pale eyes entirely dead. Earth builds. The Empire owns. This has been the natural order of the galaxy for a very long time, Commander Cross. Your insistence on citing a document older than my great-grandfather's flagship is becoming tedious. It is a 900-year-old treaty, Abigail corrected. She kept her hands folded in her lap. It established the borders. It established the peace. Cassius laughed. It was a thin, dry sound that barely disturbed the quiet air of the station. A peace we allowed. You humans are merchants, plumbers. You fix the atmospheric scrubbers on our resort worlds and haul dirty rocks from asteroid belts. We let you do this because you are quiet and because you are cheap. Do not confuse imperial indifference with a treaty of equals. Lieutenant Daniel stood behind Abigail's chair. He shifted his weight. Just a fraction of an inch. But the slight scrape of his boot on the deck plates was loud in the sterile room. Cassius's eyes flicked to the young man, narrowing in annoyance. The Empire is requisitioning the Sector 42 refineries to fuel our border expansion, Cassius stated, leaning forward. The silver stylus was gone, replaced by a heavy, ceremonial sidearm he pulled from his hip holster. He placed it on the table with a dull thud. You will sign the transfer documents, Commander. You will go back to your dirtball world, and you will tell your parliament that the Empire required a tithe. If you do this, I will not blow your transport ship out of the sky on your way home. Abigail looked at the gun. A Mark IV plasma repeater. It was beautifully maintained. The grips were inlaid with pearl. It belonged in a museum or in the hands of a man who only fired it at paper targets. I will not sign, Abigail said. She didn't blink. You are breaking the Accords. The Accords are a myth, human, Cassius sneered. A bedtime story your people tell yourselves to pretend you matter. He didn't warn her. He didn't stand up, flip a table, or shout a battle cry. He simply picked up the pistol, leveled it at Abigail's chest, and pulled the trigger. The sound was absolute. A concussive crack of superheated air that shattered the reinforced glass of the observation windows and set the overhead lights violently swinging. The smell of ozone and burnt fabric flooded the room instantly. Abigail Cross was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force of the plasma bolt. Her chair tipped over, hitting the deck with a sharp clatter. She didn't scream. Her lungs were already ash. She lay on the floor, staring blindly at the swinging lights, her uniform charred in a perfect smoking circle over her heart. The room fell dead silent again, save for the hum of the station's life support systems working overtime to scrub the toxic smoke from the air. Cassius set the gun back on the table. The barrel was smoking lightly. He looked at Lieutenant Daniel. The young aide stood completely frozen, his eyes locked on the body of his commander. You, Cassius said, his voice flat and bored. Take the garbage. Go back to Earth. Tell them the tax has been collected and the refineries are ours. If they want to argue, they can send another diplomat. I have plenty of ammunition. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't lunge for the gun. He slowly looked up from Abigail's body and met Cassius's eyes. The Imperial Governor expected to see fear. He expected to see a broken animal. Instead, he saw absolutely nothing. Daniel's face had drained of all color, but his expression was locked in a cold, terrible neutrality. "Understood," Daniel said. His voice didn't shake. He walked around the table, knelt by Abigail, and hoisted her body over his shoulder. The burnt smell transferred to his own uniform, but he didn't seem to notice. He carried her out of the room without looking back. Cassius watched him go, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Humans, always so compliant, always so pathetic. Rain lashed down on the tarmac in Geneva. It was a cold, miserable autumn downpour that turned the runway into a black mirror. President Robert Hughes stood at the edge of the landing pad. He wore a dark wool overcoat. He had refused an umbrella. The sleek, unarmed diplomatic transport descended from the low cloud cover, its thrusters kicking up a massive spray of water. It touched down heavily. The loading ramp lowered with a mechanical whine, hydraulic fluid hissing in the cold air. Lieutenant Daniel walked down the ramp. He was pushing a hover gurney. A standard cargo crate sat on top of it, hastily modified into a stasis pod using cooling units ripped from the ship's galley. Hughes didn't say a word as Daniel approached. He looked at the frost forming on the edges of the cargo crate, then up at the young lieutenant. Daniel's uniform was still stained with soot and ash. "Governor Cassius of the Sovereign Coalition," Daniel said, his voice raspy from 20 hours of silence. "Point-blank plasma discharge to the chest, over a dispute regarding the Sector 42 helium refineries." "Did she suffer?" Hughes asked. "No, sir. It was instantaneous." Hughes nodded slowly. He reached out and placed a hand on the cold metal of the crate. The rain plastered his grey hair to his forehead. He looked old suddenly, older than his 50 years, but his eyes were like flint. "The 900 years are up, then," Hughes said softly. "Yes, Mr. President." They broke the pact. Hughes turned his back on the transport ship and looked toward the distant, hazy silhouette of the Geneva skyline. For nearly a millennium, humanity had been the galaxy's punchline. The docile traders, the meek mechanics. They endured insults, heavy tariffs and casual cruelty with bowed heads and polite smiles. The Empire thought they were weak. The Empire thought the Treaty of Orion was a document written by a conquering force to keep humanity in check. They had forgotten the truth. Humanity hadn't signed the treaty to save themselves from the galaxy. They had signed it to save the galaxy from them. "Convene the High Council," Hughes ordered, walking toward the waiting motorcade. "Open the old vaults, all of them." By midnight, the gears of a machine that had slept for 9 centuries began to turn. In the orbital shipyards above Mars, Foreman David Miller stood on a gantry, drinking bitter black coffee from a thermos. He looked out over the dry docks. For his entire life, these docks had built luxury liners. Massive, floating palaces of glass and steel meant to ferry imperial nobles on sightseeing tours. A klaxon sounded. It wasn't the shift change horn. It was a deep, chest-rattling klaxon that hadn't been tested outside of drills since before David's grandfather was born. Below him, the automated welding arms abruptly stopped their delicate work on a luxury liner's promenade deck. The massive robotic cranes shifted gears. A pre-programmed sequence, locked behind layers of dormant code, had just been activated. David watched in silence as the cranes descended, gripping the elegant, sweeping outer hull plates of the luxury liner. With a grinding shriek of tearing metal, the cranes ripped the decorative plating away. Beneath the facade, hidden for generations, was raw, heavy, depleted uranium armor plating. The ship wasn't a liner. It was a dreadnought. All across the solar system, the illusion shattered. In the asteroid belt, mining lasers the size of skyscrapers were recalibrated, their targeting software switching from stationary rocks to moving vessels. Agricultural terraforming mechs on Venus dropped their plows, their internal factories churning out heavy munitions to feed into the rotary cannons concealed in their chassis. Earth didn't panic. There were no riots in the streets. There were no anti-war protests. The genetic memory of a species born in blood and fire woke up, stretched, and found it was still terribly hungry. Back in the Senate chamber on his home world, Governor Cassius was drinking a glass of spiced wine, regaling a group of visiting dignitaries with the story of the foolish human diplomat. "They don't understand authority," Cassius laughed, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. "You have to treat them like livestock. A firm hand, a bit of violence, and they fall right back into line. I expect their new ambassador to arrive by the end of the week, crawling on his knees." A communications officer hurried into the room. He looked pale. He didn't bow to the dignitaries. He walked straight to Cassius and whispered urgently in his ear. Cassius frowned, swatting the man away. "Speak up, you fool. We have no secrets from our guests. What is the anomaly?" The officer swallowed hard. The entire room went quiet, waiting. "Sir, deep space radar at the Sector 42 border just detected slip-space ruptures. So, the humans are probably sending a salvage crew for their precious refineries." "No, sir," the officer stammered, his hands shaking as he held up a datapad. "It's not a salvage crew. It's everything. The radar is registering over 10,000 capital-class signatures. They just obliterated the border garrison. They didn't even hail them. They just ran them over." Cassius stopped swirling his wine. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Admiral Croft stood on the immaculate observation deck of the Imperial flagship Resplendent. He was an officer of the old blood, a man who believed wars were won by the elegance of plasma-sheared hull plating and the civilized exchange of orbital bombardments. The garrison at Sector 42 was the jewel of the Outer Rim. 500 warships, gleaming white and gold against the backdrop of the helium-rich nebula. They had detected the slip-space ruptures 3 minutes ago. "Magnify," Croft ordered, brushing a speck of dust from his gilded epaulettes. The main view screen shimmered, zooming in on the dark expanse of space where the radar was screaming. The Imperial officers on the bridge expected to see the bulky, patchwork freighters the humans used for hauling ore. They expected to see civilian ships clumsily retrofitted with mining lasers, desperate to reclaim their lost refineries. Instead, the void simply went dark. A shadow swallowed the starlight. It wasn't a fleet. It was a wall of solid, light-devouring grey. When the human dreadnoughts finally broke into visual range, Croft felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. These were not the ships of a merchant species. They were brutalist nightmares of engineering. There were no elegant curves, no glowing engine, nacelles meant to inspire awe. They were massive, angular slabs of depleted uranium and carbon silicate armor, scarred by centuries of simulated war games. They looked less like starships and more like flying anvils, built with a singular, terrifying purpose. "Incoming transmission," the communications officer said, his voice cracking. It's an open broadcast on all frequencies. Audio only." "Put it through," Croft said, gripping the railing. "Let us hear their demands." The bridge speakers crackled. There was no grand declaration of war. There was no angry human politician demanding justice for Commander Cross. There was only the heavy, rhythmic, mechanical sound of a countdown clock. 3, 2, 1. "Shields to maximum," Croft shouted, the veneer of aristocratic calm shattering. The Imperial fleet opened fire. Thousands of superheated plasma bolts streaked across the dark expanse, illuminating the nebula in blinding flashes of violet and blue. It was a beautiful, devastating barrage. Any civilized fleet would have vaporized under the sheer thermal output. The plasma hit the human dreadnoughts, and it did nothing. The heat dispersed across the reactive ablative plating. The dark grey hulls glowed a dull red for a fraction of a second, venting the thermal energy into space, and then faded back to black. The human ships did not slow down. They did not break formation. They just kept coming. Then the humans fired back. They didn't use plasma. They didn't use lasers. They used mass. Along the dorsal ridges of the human dreadnoughts, massive magnetic coils hummed to life. The railguns fired in perfect unison. There was no flash of light, no cinematic beam of energy. There was only the physics of solid tungsten slugs, each the size of a city bus, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. An Imperial thermal shield is designed to dissipate heat. It is incredibly effective against energy weapons. It is utterly useless against 10,000 tons of dense metal moving at relativistic speeds. The slug that hit the Imperial cruiser to the left of the Resplendent didn't just penetrate the shields. It didn't just pierce the hull. The kinetic energy transfer was so absolute and so violent that the cruiser simply ceased to be a ship. It turned into a rapidly expanding cloud of atomized metal and boiling atmosphere in less than a microsecond. Croft watched the radar screen. The green dots representing his invincible fleet were winking out. Not one by one, dozens at a time, whole squadrons erased in the blink of an eye. "Return fire! Evasive maneuvers!" Croft screamed. But there was nowhere to maneuver. The human fleet had already surrounded the gravity well. Aboard the human command ship Vengeance, Fleet Admiral Barrett sat in the center of a dimly lit combat information center. He was drinking lukewarm water from a plastic cup. He wore a standard fatigue jacket. There were no medals pinned to his chest. The CIC was quiet, filled only with the low murmur of tactical officers reading off firing coordinates and the soft ping of confirming kills. Sector 42 garrison is at 15% operational capacity, the tactical officer reported, not looking up from her screen. "Keep firing," Barrett said quietly. "Target their engine blocks. Don't let them jump." Admiral, we are receiving a hail from the Imperial flagship. They are broadcasting a surrender code." Barrett looked at the main screen. The Resplendent was severely damaged, venting atmosphere from a massive tear in its port side. The golden paint was scorched black. Barrett took a sip of water. He thought of Abigail Cross. He thought of the centuries his ancestors had spent, biting their tongues, swallowing their pride, pretending to be harmless so the rest of the galaxy wouldn't have to face what humanity truly was. They had built a cage of bureaucracy and subservience to keep their own violent nature locked away. Governor Cassius had walked up to that cage and shot the lock off. "We are not here to take prisoners," Barrett said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "We are here to clear a path, silence the hail, main battery, fire for effect." The railgun shook the massive dreadnought as it fired. On the Imperial bridge, Admiral Croft didn't even have time to close his eyes. The tungsten slug caved in the bow of the Resplendent, traveling through the entire length of the ship, shredding bulkheads, reactor cores, and crew compartments before exiting the stern. The flagship snapped in half. A moment later, the reactor went critical, and the pride of the Imperial fleet was reduced to floating slag. The engagement lasted exactly 12 minutes. When it was over, the space around Sector 42 was a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen debris. The human dreadnoughts moved slowly through the wreckage, their massive thrusters burning with a cold blue light. They didn't stop to salvage. They didn't stop to gloat. They recalibrated their navigation computers, spun up their slipspace drives, and jumped toward the Imperial capital. The sky over Prime was usually a perfect, climate-controlled shade of sapphire. Today, it was the color of a bruised lung. Ash fell like dirty snow across the grand marble courtyards of the Senate district. The orbital defense platforms, the impenetrable ring of steel that had protected the Imperial homeworld for 10,000 years, were currently burning up in the upper atmosphere. Inside the Grand Senate, panic had long since given way to a numb, vibrating terror. The opulent corridors, normally filled with diplomats, aides, and silk-draped nobles, were strewn with discarded luggage and overturned statues. The elites of the Empire had tried to flee. They had rushed to the spaceports, boarding their private yachts and luxury cruisers, demanding clearance to leave the system. The human blockade hanging in orbit had not answered their hails. The automated defense grid on the dreadnoughts had simply swatted the escaping ships out of the sky like bothersome insects, letting their burning debris rain down on the sprawling megacity below. Governor Cassius sat alone in the center of the Senate floor. The massive amphitheater was empty. The lights flickered, struggling against the power surges caused by the orbital bombardment, knocking out the city's primary fusion plants. Cassius's hands were shaking. He looked down at the datapad resting on his lap. It was a copy of the Orion Accords, the document he had called a myth, the treaty he had mocked. He had spent the last 3 days reading it, over and over, analyzing the syntax, looking at the clauses he and every other imperial politician had ignored for 900 years. It wasn't a treaty of submission. The language was polite, yes. The concessions humanity made were massive. They agreed to disband their standing armies. They agreed to pay tariffs. They agreed to live on the fringes of civilized space. But as Cassius read the fine print, the cold, horrifying realization washed over him. The Accords weren't written to protect humanity from the Empire. They were written by a species that had nearly annihilated itself in endless, bloody, apocalyptic wars. A species that had looked at the stars, realized they would eventually burn down the entire galaxy if they didn't stop, and deliberately placed themselves in exile. The Accords were a set of rules humanity had created to keep themselves in check. Section 4. Clause 8. In the event of unprovoked lethal aggression against a designated human diplomatic envoy, all prior restrictions regarding military mobilization are immediately null and void. Cassius swallowed hard. His throat was dry. He had pulled a trigger because he was annoyed, because he wanted to make a point. In doing so, he had activated a machine that had been waiting in the dark, perfectly oiled, for nearly a millennium. A heavy thud echoed through the chamber. Then another. The massive gold-plated doors of the Senate entrance groaned. Something was hitting them from the outside. Not a plasma torch, not a breaching charge. Mechanical, rhythmic, kinetic impacts. With a deafening crack, the reinforced hinges sheared off. The doors fell forward, crashing onto the marble floor and sending a cloud of white dust into the air. Through the dust, they walked. They weren't wearing the pristine parade ground armor of the Imperial Guard. The human shock troopers wore heavy, matte black exosuits. They moved with heavy, deliberate steps, their boots cracking the marble floor tiles. There was no shouting, no battle cries, just the hiss of pressurized servos and the heavy thud of armor. They fanned out across the Senate floor, their heavy rifles tracking every shadow, securing the perimeter with mechanical efficiency. Finally, a single figure walked through the breached doorway. He wasn't wearing heavy armor. He wore a standard naval uniform, though it was covered in a layer of gray ash from the burning city outside. Lieutenant Daniel stopped at the edge of the central podium. He looked exactly as he had 9 days ago in the negotiation room at Sector 42. His face was a mask of total neutrality. Cassius stood up. His knees felt weak. He tried to project the authority he had wielded for decades, but his voice betrayed him. It cracked, high and thin. "You have made your point," Cassius said, stepping down from the podium. He held his hands out, empty. "The capital is yours. We have ordered the planetary guard to stand down. I am prepared to discuss the terms of our surrender. We will cede Sector 42. We will grant humanity full representation in the Senate. We can negotiate a new peace." Daniel walked toward him. The heavy boots of the human soldiers flanking him echoed in the vast, empty room. "Negotiations concluded 9 days ago, Governor," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, completely devoid of anger. It was the voice of an auditor, finding an error in a ledger. "You cannot wipe us out," Cassius pleaded, his aristocratic mask fully crumbling into desperation. "We are the Sovereign Coalition. We have held this galaxy together for 10,000 years. If you destroy us, the power vacuum will tear the outer systems apart. You need us to maintain the order." Daniel stopped a few feet from Cassius. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a datapad. It was charred around the edges. It had a dark, rusty stain smeared across the screen. It was the same datapad Abigail Cross had placed on the table in Sector 42. "We are not here to rule your empire, Cassius," Daniel said. "We don't want your Senate. We don't want your worlds. We are plumbers. We are merchants. We fix what is broken, and we take out the garbage." Cassius looked at the datapad. He looked at the bloodstain. He realized with a final, crushing clarity that humanity wasn't here to conquer. Conquest implied a desire for territory. Conquest implied an emotional investment in the enemy. Humanity was just here to clean up a mess. Daniel handed the datapad to one of the armored shock troopers standing beside him. Then he unholstered the heavy, blocky kinetic pistol at his hip. It was an ugly weapon, a tool of pure function. "You broke the accords," Daniel said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink. The penalty for breach of contract was clearly outlined. President Hughes sends his regards. Cassius opened his mouth to scream, to beg, to offer anything he had left. Daniel leveled the pistol at Cassius's chest and pulled the trigger. The sound was absolute, a concussive crack that echoed up into the vaulted ceilings of the Senate. Cassius was thrown backward, hitting the marble steps of the podium. He didn't scream. He lay on the floor, staring blindly up at the flickering lights, his chest caved in by a heavy tungsten slug. The room fell dead silent again, save for the hum of the human exosuits and the distant, muffled thud of orbital strikes leveling the military installations outside the city. Daniel looked down at the body. He felt no triumph. He felt no joy. He only felt the heavy, exhausting weight of 1,000 years of history crashing back down onto his species' shoulders. They had tried to walk away from the darkness. They really had. "Confirm the target is neutralized," Daniel said to the trooper beside him. "Target neutralized, sir," the trooper replied, his voice distorted by a helmet speaker. "Good. Gather the squad. We're going back to Earth." Daniel turned his back on the dead governor and walked toward the ruined doors of the Senate. Let the rest of the galaxy clean up the mess. Outside, the rain began to fall, mixing with the ash to coat the burning capital in a thick, grey sludge. The human fleet held its position in orbit, silent, watchful, and deeply, terribly awake. The 900-year peace was over. The era of the Empire was dead. The plumbers had finished their work. The cage is broken, and the galaxy will never be the same. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more epic sci-fi content. We explore the darkest and most thrilling corners of the universe every week. Share this video with your friends and drop a comment below. Did Cassius get what he deserved? Join our community and never miss a single story. See you next time.